In this session, we're going to be talking some more about choice theories of addiction, following on from the previous session, where we first introduced the notion of choice and some of the theoretical perspectives that conceptualise addiction as an issue of choice or decision-making. Two key things I'm going to cover. The first is quite an important model, a comprehensive model, that's been introduced as a way of understanding addiction as a decision-making deficit, or a process by which the difficulties that people experience with addictive behaviour can be understood as deficits in decision-making processes. This is quite an important model because it doesn't specify just one specific problem, but identifies a potential range of vulnerabilities that people can experience that could lead down the pathway to the development of addictive behaviour. I'm then going to finish on something which is far broader and almost sort of a semi-philosophical discussion about this concept of a crazier and the extent to which we can conceptualise or conceive of addiction as a form of a crazier. So first on to decision-making deficits. A paper published in 2008 by Reddish, Jensen and Johnson postulates what I refer to as the broken decision-making hypothesis of addictive behaviour. And really what this means is that there are many ways in which we can make decisions, so the various mechanisms, cognitive mechanisms that are used to inform decision-making are complex. It's obviously not just as straightforward as making conscious decisions. There are lots of underlying processes, both conscious and non-conscious, that contribute to the decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. And what Reddish, Jensen and Johnson identified were a number of different ways in which there is evidence to show that these processes can be undermined in different ways and to different degrees. Now, the fundamental premise of this particular approach is this idea that our central nervous system has adapted to make decisions based on proximal and distal information. By proximal information, we mean information which is close to us kind of here and now. So it could be the way that you're currently feeling, it could be the situation that you currently find yourself in, that kind of immediate, close information. But we also make decisions on the basis of distally held information. For example, knowledge of the long-term consequences of actions that we may choose to take now. And of course, that information isn't always necessarily congruent or consistent with one another. We can be in a position where making a decision based upon proximally held information, which is that if you do something that will make you feel great, isn't necessarily consistent with the fact that it could in the longer term cause you other difficulties. So food would be a really good example of that. Knowing that you eat something that's very sugary and sort of highly calorific, or junk food or whatever, it may make you feel immediately satiated or gratified, or you enjoy the experience of eating something that isn't necessarily healthy. But you also know that if you eat in that way over a long period of time, that in the long term that's going to lead to all manner of health problems. And so that's where you can see a conflict emerging between the decisions that people may choose to make based upon different types of information. Now, just on this particular point, I think it's important to try to make connections with other theoretical perspectives that we've considered as we've worked through the various different theoretical models of addiction. And we consider this notion of contiguity. We know from learning theory, the concept of the principle of contiguity is that things that are closer in time, rewards or reinforcements that are closer in time to particular actions, are much more powerful shapers of our behaviour. And so when we're considering proximal and distal information, it's important to bear that in mind and think about, from a health behaviour perspective, why it may be that very often people may choose to engage in the thing that could in the longer term cause them harm, but in the immediate term may bestow some benefit or reward. And that's very often the case for the various health behaviours, that the long-term negative consequences are the distal information, the information that impacts less on shaping behaviour, has a harder time of grabbing your attention, compared to the proximal information, which is normally the immediate benefit or reward from engaging in the behaviour, whatever it may be. So Reddish et al. Are then suggesting that addiction is an instance of maladaptive decision-making, and that's driven by this combination of both the pharmacological effects of drugs, if we're making reference to drug addiction, but other behavioural addictions as well, so the immediate psychopharmacological effects of these drugs, and experiential events in the case of behavioural dependence, such as gambling. So Between these two things, the decision making that we're engaging in the context of addictive behaviour is conceptualised as being maladaptive, that your decisions are being made in a way that aren't serving your long-term interests, as it were, but are somehow being derailed by the development of addictive behaviour. So the human machinery of decision-making is thought to be vulnerable to different kinds of intervention. So these both pharmacological or experiential events that can lead to these maladaptive decisions being made, that a person can become trapped almost in a pattern of making decisions that are, over a period of time, causing them problems. So addiction is seen as a condition of maladaptive decision-making from this perspective. So it's important then to understand and to question what it is that the decision-making system is. If the decision-making system has become maladaptive, then the important question is, well, what is that system? What underlies our capacity to make decisions in general terms? Reddish et al. Identified three specific systems. The first of which is actually potentially a subset of one of the others, the habit system, but it's important that they separate this out for a particular reason. They make reference to the situation recognition system, the planning system, and the habit system. So the situation recognition system is kind of what it says on the tin. It's the extent to which we are, in any given circumstance, able to recognise the situation that we're in, to understand what the current demands and the sort of problems and so on exist for us at that time that we may need to address. And also then to match over time. So when we've been in different situations in the past, if you've engaged in a behaviour that has led to a particular outcome in a particular situation and that's been positive, then as we know from operant conditioning and operant theory, we know that that's something you're likely to do again in the future. Now what Reddish et al. Are making reference to here with the situation recognition system is this idea that there is literally a cognitive system that underpins determining in any given situation whether or not the situation you're in right now is actually similar to a situation that you've been in the past. Because of course situations as we move from one point in time to the next, they're never identical. We never find ourselves in a situation where absolutely everything is exactly the same as it was the last time that we chose a particular action over another. So we need to have some cognitive capacity to be able to make comparisons between different situations, to decide whether or not a particular course of action that may have benefited us in a situation previously is the right course of action to choose in the current situation, which may differ to a lot greater or lesser degree. And so the situation recognition system is important because it's one that can also be undermined. I'll explain that in just a moment. They then make reference to the planning and the habit systems, and I've made reference here, or cross-reference, to what we refer to as System 1 and System 2. So in cognitive psychology, when we're making determinations, you can often hear talk about dual process theories of addiction. Dual process theories of addiction, essentially, dual process theories of human cognition in general, make a distinction between two different types of cognitive process. The System 1 processes, the System 2 processes. System 1 is essentially the older, in evolutionary terms, the older system which underlies associative learning. So it's the automatic, often non-conscious system of the brain. System 2 is the higher level, effortful, attentional systems, the executive functioning, working memory, problem-solving system, which in evolutionary terms is a lot more recent and is also what enables us to engage in much more complex reasoning. And so they're making reference here what Reddish, Jensen and Johnson refer to as the planning and the habit system are effectively System 1 and System 2, implicit, explicit, automatic controlled systems. Important thing to know about the planning system is it's goal-oriented. It's based on algorithmic decision-making. So when you're using your planning system, you're, in an algorithmic sense, you're making decisions based upon information, you're weighing up pros and cons and so on and so forth, based on a calculated expected outcome. So if you make a decision using the planning system, then you're engaging in an effortful form of conscious thinking where you're making a decision about what the best thing is to do next. The habit system, or the automatic implicit System 1 system, is The often unconscious, although the consequences of what this system doesn't always need to be unconscious, but essentially it's the system which is just throwing up implicit automatic responses to situations based upon all of your prior learning. So when we're making decisions utilising the habit system, we are quite literally, as the name would suggest, making decisions that are based upon the successful strategies that we've used in the past. So the things that we've done in the past that have, using our situation recognition system that we identify as being similar to the situation that we find ourselves in now, the habit system will just immediately prompt you. It will kind of throw up ideas and suggestions as to what you do next. And so the habit system is really important because it drives a lot of our behaviour. In ordinary life, it drives a lot of our behaviour. But it's non-conscious. It's not something that we put we have executive control over, and we may sometimes need to override what the habit system may throw up to us. So, to take a really simplistic example, if you're walking a particular route that you often walk, or driving a particular route that you often drive, but for some reason you need to take a detour, if you don't pay attention, so to speak, you may find that you accidentally go the route that you always go. You forget to take the detour. And in order to take the detour, you need to initiate the planning system to make a decision about when to stop or indicate or make a manoeuvre in order to take you off of this route that you've travelled quite a lot. I've certainly found that myself when I've been walking around the building at work, that if I'm on my phone, as we often are now, looking at emails and so on, that before I realise it, I was walking to another building that I don't often go to, and I found myself in a completely different part of the building, just travelling the route that's most travelled. And so these systems interact to help us make decisions in any particular context, to identify and to categorise the situation that we currently find ourselves in, to determine its similarity or not to previous situations. And then we have the impact of the habit system, which will throw up the previously learned and experienced actions and suggestions for what we might do next. But then, of course, we have this planning system, which can engage in more effortful cognition or thinking about the best thing to do, which is particularly important if the situation recognition system tells you that your current situation is novel, that the situation you're currently in now, you have no pre-planned or pre-existing suggestions as to how to deal with what you're currently facing. So these are the decision-making systems that Reddish et al. Identify in their model. And these are common systems in cognitive psychology. They're not specific or novel to this particular model of addiction. But they are important for understanding the particular deficits that they identify. So throughout the paper, and I do recommend it, giving it a read, it's a very detailed paper and it contains a number of quite an extensive review of the literature in the addictions field, identifying the various different bodies of evidence that support the things that I'm just about to go through in slightly more detail. And it's an interesting approach to understanding addiction, because rather than saying that, as we've seen with previous theories, that it's about something specific, it's about the development of incentive sensitisation, for example, actually what Reddish et al. Were trying to do is to identify that while at its heart they think that addiction is about the development of maladaptive decision-making, they weren't constraining or haven't constrained their theory by saying that it's one particular type of maladaptive decision-making. Actually, there can be lots of types, lots of different ways within which our ability or our decision-making processes can become subverted or hijacked, if you prefer that term, when people develop problems with addictive behaviour. So there are several, and actually there's a lot more in the paper, but I'm going to cover some of the ones that I think are most important. The first thing that they identify is this notion that our current needs can change quickly. So based upon our previously learned experiences, if we're faced with a particular situation, we decide what to do next, and we implement our decision. So through life, you're constantly travelling through time, you have to make decisions. The problem is that our current needs can change quickly, and our decision-making systems aren't necessarily set up to deal with particularly abrupt changes to the way that we're currently feeling, the way that we're currently experiencing the world. And so a good example of that would be when people are experiencing withdrawal, which would be strongly associated with opiate use. For instance, this may lead to a perceived need to use again to restore homeostasis. So your needs prior to experiencing withdrawal is that you're not currently intending or planning to use opiates. But if you end up experiencing withdrawal symptoms, that's going to be an immediate and quite salient trigger that you may need to use again in order to restore some balance, to take away those feelings of withdrawal. And so where our needs change quite quickly, our behaviours may change quite quickly, which could lead to what we observe in the context of addiction as being impulsive decision making, people acting on impulse in order to meet the current needs that have changed rapidly in the moment. They make reference to this notion of reward mimicking. Now, we've encountered this idea in a slightly different way in the past. When we've looked at the reward pathways, this idea that when people are using drugs, and particularly those drugs that are often associated with development of dependence, that when you take these drugs, they have a particular effect on the dopaminergic reward pathways, that it leads your brain to believe that this has been a very rewarding experience, and it continues to lead your brain to perceive that even once tolerance has developed and the effect of the drug subjectively isn't as strong as it may have been in the past. And so, because learning takes place through reward recognition, because the dopaminergic reward pathways are in and of themselves completely normative systems, they're actually designed to help us in the world for the most part. The problem is that when you're using drugs which mimic those sorts of natural rewards, and in some cases mimic them to a very high degree, and to sort of almost magnify the experience of reward that you would ordinarily have, that's another vulnerability in the decision-making apparatus, that if drugs are having this effect on the system, which is usually there to help us, but it's almost abusing that system, then it's easy to see how that could be one of the ways for drugs that have that particular effect. That's why it is that these drugs can be so dependence producing. Why it is we often hear people talking about or asking questions about whether or not something is addictive. That's often making reference to the pharmacological properties of a drug, but of course the psychological properties of the drug are also important. That the extent to which you perceive the effect of that drug as being extremely rewarding is going to increase the likelihood that you do it again in the future, to some extent, regardless of the pharmacological properties. They introduce also this idea of the overvaluation of the value of an action, and that's linked to this previous idea of reward mimicking and the specific impact of drugs on the dopaminergic reward pathways. So the expectancies of reward guide what you do next. So in any given situation, you recognise the situation that you're in, you recognise that if you do something that will lead to some positive outcome. But of course, any behaviour that you overvalue, that you perceive as being more important than other behaviours, is likely to be increased in terms of how often you select to do it. How often you choose to do a behaviour is going to increase as a function of how much value you place in that behaviour. And for drugs like nicotine, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, alcohol, and so on, the drugs that people often find that they develop problems with, because they lead to this rapid release of dopamine, it magnifies the rewarding effects of the expected outcome, much more so than any kind of natural rewarding behaviour that you may experience in day-to-day life outside of drug use. And so that leads you to overvalue the value of an action, to overvalue the expected consequences of what that drug will do, as I said just now, even in the absence of any subjective positive effects as a result of the development of long-term tolerance. There's also, and again this is something that comes up in broader psychological literature, this illusion of control. So if you wrongly believe that you have more control over a particular behaviour than you in fact do, then that's likely to lead you into making decisions which could be, in the longer term, problematic. And so gambling is a really good example of this. It's been shown, so that Toplak and her colleagues have looked at this and identified things like, for example, the gambler's fallacy. So if I were to say to you, I've tossed a coin 3 times and each of those times it's come up heads, what's the probability it's going to come up heads on the 4th occasion when I toss the coin? Now, if you understand probability, then actually you should know that the chances of it coming up heads or tails on the 4th coin toss remains 50-50. It remains a 50-50 outcome, because in that moment it doesn't matter what the previous heads or tails outcomes were, because each one of those is an independent coin toss, and it's just as likely that it's going to come up heads, making 4 in a row, than it is to come up as tails. Now, the gambler's fallacy, or one of the gambler's fallacies, is that people who have problems with gambling have been shown in a number of studies now to have the kind of superstitious beliefs that they would say somebody that, or if you're likely to have, if you have problems with gambling, you would be more likely to say, well, no, it's not going to come up tails the fourth time, isn't it? Because that's quite unlikely. It's probably going to come up, heads. So it's going to come up tails this time because you've already had 3 heads previously. The fact that it's completely unrelated is something that these people don't believe, and so as a result of that, it puts you at greater risk of developing problems with things like gambling. Classic example of that is the idea of believing in winning and losing streaks, or believing in sort of a lucky rabbit's foot, as sort of the stereotypical example, but believing that there are certain things that can influence the outcome of random events. And so this illusion of control, over thinking that if you do something, if you're on a winning streak, you should bet more, then of course that can lead to problems. It can lead to greater problems if you have an illusion of control over things over which you actually have no control at all, or a much more limited degree of control than perhaps you think you do. Discounting deficits relates again neatly to the previous example in relation to gambling. So it's fairly well established that amongst people who have problems with addictive behaviour, that they have something called the delayed discounting deficit. And the delayed discounting deficit can be simply explained, a simple example of it would be preferring shorter and smaller rewards quickly over bigger rewards in the longer term. So, really simple example, if I offered you £5 now or £10 in 2 days' time, which would you prefer? And people that have a high degree of delayed discounting would be more likely to say, I'll take the £5 now over the £10 in 2 days' time, even though 2 days isn't a long time to wait. It's not money that you're probably expecting to get, and so why not wait and get twice as much? But it's commonly observed that when people have problems with addiction, they also demonstrate this delayed discounting deficit. And so as a result of that, again, decisions that people are making means that they're prioritising immediate gratification over longer term gratification, and particularly even if that gratification in the longer term or reward may be significantly greater than the reward or gratification that's experienced right now. So discounting deficits, and again there's a whole literature on this showing that this varies by people, that it can vary over time, and for different sorts of rewards and in different situations, is another of the deficits in our decision-making apparatus that can lead people potentially into the development of addiction, but can also help to sustain it. Do I use drugs now to take away the immediate experience of withdrawal, which is aversive, or do I continue to go through and try to manage the symptoms of withdrawal and the discomfort that goes with that for the longer term, kind of much higher goal that I'm hoping to achieve, which is to maintain recovery. So discounting deficit can play an important role in that. Learning rate changes as well can be problematic in that drugs can impair these processes, meaning that behavioural associations develop and they can be difficult to alter. So what this means is that faster and slower learning, in terms of how quickly you learn certain things and how quickly drugs in particular can have an impact on your speed of learning. Thinking about, again, going back to the sessions on learning theory, this idea of contiguity and this idea that certain drugs have a very, very euphoric effect and a very rewarding effect. These differences in learning rates between addictive behaviours and other forms of behaviours can also play a role in skewing our decision-making and choices. And then there's this whole balance between key systems that these are just some of the systems that are identified in the Reddish et al. Paper, but all of these systems have to balance, and that any imbalance with any of them can have a big impact on the way in which our decisions are made over a longer period of time. The switching, for example, between planning and habit. So in any given situation, you are usually faced with kind of automatic responses about what it is that you might do next. Yeah? So the habit system is always there, it's working constantly for us in day-to-day life, not just about sort of things related to addiction or health behaviour, but just in general. What do you do next? What are the things that you need to do in order to kind of get through the day? So the habit system is really powerful, it's really useful, but of course there are occasions when you need to switch, when you're in a situation where you know that what you've done previously isn't going to work, you're going to need to put some more effort and thought into what you're doing. Say for example, if you were thinking about moving house or changing job or starting a relationship or ending a relationship or deciding whether to have kids or any sort of big life decisions, the habit system isn't useful for helping you with those sorts of decisions. You need to switch to planning. You need to start thinking more effortfully and thinking about what the consequences and the pros and cons and the whole decisional balance thing. But the problem is that if either of these systems becomes impaired or excessively activated, particularly in the case of the habit system, then people can rely too heavily on them, and our decision-making processes may not necessarily go in the direction that we want to in the longer term. They won't serve our best interests. So having this balance between these key systems, or in the case of addictive behaviour, what Reddish et al. Would argue is an imbalance between these systems, can also help us to understand some of the problematic or what may seem counterintuitive behaviours that people can demonstrate over time. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about in relation to addiction and choice is this notion of a crazier. Now, a crazier is a philosophical concept back from sort of early Greek philosophy. And it's essentially just acting against your better judgment. So an acratic action means doing something that is against your better judgment. And it is a philosophical concept. There's huge amounts that have been written about it. But it's recently in the last sort of 20 years or so, been applied to start thinking about the sort of fundamental process, the nature of addiction. Because the theories that we've looked at just now in the previous section, thinking about the nature of choice in addiction, should really beg this really big question. Is addiction a weakness of will? To what extent is it that if you're experiencing a problem with addiction, that actually there is just a weakness or an impairment in your willful, freely chosen behaviour? Now, it has been argued, and I'll give some examples in just a moment, it's been argued that a meaningful way of understanding addiction is to understand it as an example of acratic action, of extreme acrasia. Now, acrasia is something that isn't pathological. We engage in acratic behaviours all of the time. If you ever do something that you know at the moment that you're doing it isn't necessarily the best thing for you, and that it's at odds with other longer term goals, then you've behaved acratically. And so acrasia in the context of addiction's being understood or described as an extreme form of acrasia, but a form of it nonetheless, on a continuum. So just to note, there are 4 conditions, importantly, that need to be met in order for a behaviour in general to be considered acratic. The first is it needs to be a freely chosen action. Okay, so your behaviour is not acratic if you have no choice over what you're choosing to do. If you have no actual choice over what you're choosing to do, you're being forced to engage in a behaviour or something like that, then it's not acratic behaviour, it's a whole different thing. So you have to be freely choosing the thing that you engage in. It also needs to be intentional, i.e. you've done it on purpose, that not only is this a free choice that you're making, but you intend to do the thing that you've chosen to do. That is something that once you've engaged in the behaviour, it's not something that was accident. You intended to do what you did. It also needs to be it needs to be contrary to your better judgment. So that better judgment kind of criterion is often described, or has been described, as based on kind of practical reason or practical rationality, this idea of all things considered. So here and now, in this particular moment, I'm doing something that I know on balance is against my better judgment. My better judgment is telling me that I shouldn't do it, or it's not the best thing for me to do, but nonetheless I'm doing it anyway. And the most important thing is that it can't be retrospective. A behaviour cannot be considered acratic if it's retrospective. If retrospectively you reflect on something you did and think, well, it wasn't really such a great idea. If, for example, I decided to eat an entire birthday cake to myself, I knew at the time that it was a free choice, I had the choice to not do it or do it. I sat eating the cake and it was intentional, I meant to do it. But I didn't consider it to be against my better judgment at the time. That's not acratic behaviour. That's, call it something else, but it's not acratic. If I've sat and thought to myself, is this really the best thing for me to do? Is my best judgment telling me that eating an entire birthday cake is a good thing, all things considered? Then that's not an acratic behaviour. If, however, as you would imagine that I would, and I'm sure that I would if I was ever in this situation where I was faced with a large birthday cake to eat all to myself, I'd like to think that I would know, even if I chose to do it, I'd like to think that I'd know that it's not the best thing to have done. And so acratic behaviours are not behaviours that are only regretted after you've done them. They're kind of regretted at the time, in a sense. So it's against your better judgment that you make the choice to do it freely and intentionally at the time. And so these are the 4 conditions that have to be met in order for a behaviour to be considered acratic. Now, I'll come on to that in the context of addiction specifically in just a second, but I want to show you this, which is based on just over 20 years ago, Nick Heather, in trying to argue what an adequate theory of addiction ought to be able to explain. Heather made this argument that understanding addiction as the function of neuroadaptations or even desires for drugs or behaviours that are addictive are not alone adequate to explain addiction. That a theory of addiction cannot be based purely on an understanding of the neuroscience of what goes on in the brain, what may have sort of pre-existed in the brain, whether it's genetic predispositions or whatever it may be, neuroadaptations that exist prior to your use that make the experience of using certain drugs more pleasurable for you than for most people. Heather's argument was that that's not sufficient. That's just a kind of a description of something that's happening in the brain. So an adequate theory of addiction would also need to include an understanding of the role that desires or possibly cravings play in our ongoing behaviour and the sort of the ongoing chronic use of a drug engagement in addictive behaviour over time. But even that on its own, or in combination with the neuroscientific level of understanding, is not sufficient. What Heather was arguing is that acrasia is the thing that actually sits at the top of the explanatory tree. Because fundamentally, what we do know about addiction is that for many people, at least at certain points in their experience of having a problem with addictive behaviour, will report something that looks remarkably like acrasia. That they engaged in the behaviour, they appeared to engage in the behaviour, making free choices to do it, intentionally doing it on purpose, knowing at the time that it wasn't in their best interest, knowing that they wanted to quit but feeling that they couldn't. Now, what Heather was arguing is that actually the idea of there being a sort of loss of control in an absolute sense isn't supported by the evidence. None of the theories that were covered previously on impulse and self-control, and we've previously discussed those, none of those theories demonstrate that people completely lose control. There can be a weakening of will or whatever you may call it. But actually this concept of acrasia, this engaging in a behaviour that is against your better judgment, you're not smoking and you're while being completely unaware of the really serious health concerns, problems that can be caused by smoking tobacco, you're not doing it completely ignorant of those facts. For most people in this day and age, certainly in developed countries, developed nations, it would be almost impossible to be a smoker and be unaware of the fact that tobacco smoking is considered to be extremely detrimental to health. So why is it that people engage in behaviours? And particularly once people say they want to stop and that they say they want to quit, why do they find it so difficult? Is this a form of acratic behaviour? And so that's what Heather was arguing when he introduced this idea of acrasia into our understanding and thinking about addiction. That just saying that a person has neuroadaptations in their brain, just saying that somebody experiences strong desires, compulsions, urges or cravings, those things are important, but they're not sufficient for explaining addiction. And what we need to get to in terms of our understanding of addictive behaviour is an understanding of that core acrasia, that acrasia that appears to exist at the heart of addiction for many people. Acting against your better judgment and knowing that you do it. Now, there is an important question here that was raised by the late Jürgen Skog, who, in response to Heather's construction of this notion that acrasia is something that exemplifies addiction, he presented this kind of counterfactual model where essentially what he was questioning is, okay, so if we say that addictive behaviour is acratic behaviour, if we say that addiction is a form of acrasia, where do we get to with that? Is the implication then, because of course what we've also said is it's not possible for a behaviour to be acratic if you are doing it knowingly, if you're doing the behaviour without, if you're addicted to something but you're engaging in the addictive behaviour and not against your better judgment, that's not acratic behaviour. Acratic behaviour has to be against your better judgment. So what of a person who, for example, is drinking and has an issue with alcohol as far as any kind of clinical guidelines may be concerned. But actually, for this person, they've never stopped and thought to themselves, maybe I need to do something about my drinking. What if that person has never attempted to quit? And so what Scott was contending is that actually thinking about addiction as purely a form of crazier, maybe sort of artificially, it becomes a sort of weird semantic argument that effectively a prerequisite for saying somebody's addicted is that that person has to have attempted to stop or has to want to stop. And so what we're saying there is almost that there's a risk that what we end up arguing is that for people who are addicted, but actually whether they're in denial or whatever you want to call it, if they're not acting in their own against their own better judgment, then they're not addicted. Because if we're saying that addiction is a form of a crazier, and a crazier requires that you know that you're doing something that's against your better judgment, then essentially it seems to sort of create this kind of weird paradox almost, that you're only addicted once you attempt to stop and find that you can't. And so what Scott kind of demonstrated in this illustration here were the various different, what he refers to across the bottom scale there, of degrees of dissonance. So this idea that you can be in a lower or higher degree of dissonance, starting from the top there. Do you feel enslaved? Well, if you don't feel enslaved, you could be described as a naive addict, but you're certainly not engaging in critic behaviour because you don't feel enslaved in any way. So therefore, you're doing a behaviour which you don't even think is problematic. It cannot be a critic if that's the case. If you feel enslaved, the next question could be, well, are you ambivalent to that enslavement? So if the answer to that is yes, then it's becoming more a critic. But if the answer is no, if you're not ambivalent, if actually you feel enslaved, but you're not kind of ambivalent about that enslavement, you're not sort of thinking, should I, shouldn't I, then you're sort of what you describe as a happy addict, that you're simply kind of going with it. And Heather, when responding to this, kind of uses the example of somebody who may be in a situation where, as a result of their drug or alcohol use, things in their life have gone so badly that actually the decision this person's making is that I will be less unhappy if I carry on doing it than if I quit. Because if I quit, then my whole life has fallen apart and I'll be sober. Whereas, as it stands, if I carry on drinking, for instance, then my whole life has fallen apart, but at least I'm drinking. So there's this idea that it's not necessarily always, on balance for an individual, the case that they would have to decide that they want to stop, even if other people may think that they should. Then there's this idea of, if somebody is ambivalent, have they ever struggled with trying to stop? If no, then sort of what Scott described as a subclinical addict. If yes, if they're currently struggling, the answer to that being no, they'd be a resigned addict, somebody that's just kind of an ongoing long-term addiction. If they're yes, the answer is that they're a clinical addict. And the idea is that this as we move along this cycle, we start to experience more of this dissonance that's important to the concept of a crazier. It's important that people are experiencing some dissonance in a way because their behaviour is not aligned with what they believe the best thing for them to do might be. Heather's response to this is essentially to say that that's fair enough, that this argument is fair enough. It's not useful, it's quite a distraction conceptually to say that a person can only be addicted if they've attempted to quit. What he concedes in this argument is that actually it's important to say that a person is addicted if either they've attempted and found it difficult and therefore are acting in their better judgment, or if it's likely that were they to attempt to stop, they would experience such difficulty. Now, of course, that can still be difficult to demonstrate. How do you pick two people that are drinking very, very heavily and identify which of the two of them would find it hard to stop and which would actually be able to stop or quit or cut down immediately should they ever so desire to? It's still a difficult thing, but it raises an interesting question about the nature of this addiction being a critic behaviour. So is addictive behaviour a critic behaviour? This remains an open question and still being discussed by addiction scientists and philosophers alike. But the reason that I make reference to it is that in understanding and conceptualising addiction as a problem of choice, I think really drilling down to this very core question about what the choice is that people are making, whether or not the choice that someone's making is based on or against or in line with their better judgment, is really quite fundamental. And so I think it's important to have this in mind when we step back from the various different theories of choice, but of course impulse and self-control, and all the various other theories of addiction that have been covered in previous sessions, to sort of ask these big questions, these big theoretical, deep questions. What do we fundamentally think the nature of addiction is? Now, Heather, in a recent chapter in a book that he co-edited with Gabriel Siegel on addiction and choice, wrote a chapter going into quite some detail about this notion of crazier and addiction. And what he notes, interestingly, is that actually there's a lot of congruence with this idea, this concept of crazier, and a number of the lines of scientific research and theory in addiction, almost all of which we covered in our various sessions. The first that he notes is sort of behavioural economics and delayed discounting theories. I've just mentioned those a little while ago. This idea that individuals can be in a situation where they will favour kind of shorter, smaller rewards in a shorter period of time than larger rewards over a longer period of time, and that the fact that that's something that seems to be associated with the development of addictive behaviour is something very common amongst people with problems of addiction. That's entirely consistent with this idea of critic behaviour. You are literally choosing to take a smaller reward right now rather than waiting what might even be a modest period of time for a much better reward in the longer term. And so that's against if you assume that somebody would like to have bigger rewards and over a longer period of time, then it makes sense that the idea of crazier is consistent with that. Is you're acting against your better judgment. You may well be acting against your better judgment. It's also consistent with the idea of dual process theories. So this, again, as just referenced a moment ago, the habit and the planning system, we have these two systems that are not necessarily always congruent with one another. The automatic, impulsive, habitual system may be generating suggestions for how you should act in a particular situation that may not necessarily be consistent with the decisions that you make at an explicit level using the planning system. You may decide to act against your best interest in previous experiences or act consistently with them. The work on ego depletion and self-regulation, Baumeister's work in this area, is also consistent with this idea of addiction being a form of aquatic behaviour. And finally, interestingly, and I say interestingly because Heather is a strong opponent to what we describe as the brain disease model of addiction, he highlights that actually this concept of addiction and crazier is a potentially unifying concept in terms of bringing together and rethinking some of our understanding of neuroscientific evidence, where actually if we're understanding, not looking at some of this evidence as being a de facto explanation of addiction, that there are neuroadaptations and changes in the brain and so on. Authors and researchers like Mark Lewis would argue that these are not necessarily pathological, they're just things that have changed. The structure and the function of the brain changes in response to anything that we do. In addiction, that's no different, it's just not pathological. What Heather was suggesting here is that some of these impairments in the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with behavioural control and the dopaminergic pathways that we've mentioned in many sessions now and just now, the dopaminergic reward pathways are certainly involved to a great extent in the development of addictive behaviour. These things are also consistent with the idea that this is aquatic behaviour. This is people being in a situation where things are stacked against them in various ways, whether because of the development of delayed discounting deficit, whether because of conflicts between the habit, the planning, the situation recognition system, whether because of the depletion of self-regulatory control in a particular context or period of time, or because of changes in the structure and function of the brain and impairments that may have emerged in relation to impulse control. All of these things could lead a person to a situation where they appear to be behaving aquatically, appear to be behaving in a way that is against their better balanced judgment, doing something they don't wish to do, that they will know at the time that they don't wish to do, but they nonetheless do it anyway. And that really does get to the heart of the nature of what we understand addiction to be, at least on a descriptive level. What we really need to do next now, and why I say this is a live area of work and thinking in the addictions field, is something that's really important to get to grips with, because I think once we come to understand more about that, it becomes a lot easier to start bringing together all of these different streams and strands of evidence that we have to develop a more integrated and sophisticated understanding of what we think addiction is. So what will be covered in this session? So the main thing that we covered, or the main two things that we covered, the only two things that we covered, in fact, was this theory of addiction as being a problem of decision-making, the decision-making deficit model of addiction presented by Reddish, Jensen and Johnson. As I say, I'd encourage you, if you're interested in this particular strand of work in the addictions field, to read that paper. It's very well written. It's a long paper, but it's very well written. It actually covers a huge breadth of research and evidence to demonstrate how when we develop problems with addiction, it can often be due to multiple combinations of deficits or vulnerabilities in the way that people make decisions generally. I then kind of took a step back in a way from some of the specific theories that we've looked at in this session and previous sessions on choice and impulse and other aspects of addiction from a learning perspective, and spoke about this concept of a crazier, this idea that it's possible for people in general, and indeed you might argue more common than not, for us to behave in ways that are against our better judgment, and that it may be useful for us to think about addiction as being at the extreme end of that continuum, but on a continuum nonetheless, that addiction is an acratic behaviour like other acratic behaviours, other things that we do that are against our better judgment, making poor food choices or whatever it may be. But in the context of addiction, it just becomes more extreme. And we looked at how that could be, or some of the difficulties with that idea, about what that implies, the idea that you're not addicted potentially if it's not actually against your better judgment. So we looked at some of the theoretical issues that sit around that, but also considered how ideas, big ideas like this in the addictions field, can start to help us to synthesise and bring together some of the complicated and many and varied theories that we've covered across the multiple sessions where we've been considering addictions theory. And so I hope that's been useful.